emblems and black uniforms that was suddenly in charge of the Reich's brain trust. As we traced the flight of German engineers and scientists abroad, men and women who were not considered war criminals by the Allies, but who nonetheless were in steady motion over borders and across oceans, we found that those who were not being sought by the Nuremberg tribunals were still a threat. The Nuremberg trials were designed to identify and indict war criminals. They were not set up to defang Germany's industrial or scientific base. America's Operation Safe Haven was supposed to do that, but it ended in a lackluster record with little to show for it. Thus, scientists, engineers, and various academics who were not identified as having committed war crimes were ignored. Others, like von Braun and Dornberger, and as we revealed recently, even General Hans Kammler, were recruited by the Allies themselves. Still others, like Klaus Barbie, would escape under American IC cover and set up their activities in their new theaters of operations, this time targeting the Soviet Union. The infamous SS men were the ones everybody knows about from books and film. Men like Josef Mengele, Adolf Eichmann, Walter Rauch, Eduard Rochman, and others. But the real threat were the otherwise nameless individuals who made the trains run on time all the way to the death camps, or who designed rockets for testing in the wind tunnels of Austria, Argentina, Australia, and America. That was the state of play in 1945. The congressional report quoted earlier was published in June of that year, while the war in Asia was still raging. By 1947, or even as early as 1946, according to Counterintelligence Corps, CIC officers in Europe, everything had changed. The new enemy was the Soviet Union, and attempts to curtail or eliminate German-held corporations and German technological research in foreign countries had ceased. The best efforts of the U.S. government investigators to get to the bottom of the Nazi financial and scientific diaspora would evaporate. American politicians would vie for the title of most anti-communist, while those who insisted that countries like Argentina, who still harbored Nazi assets, be held accountable and divest, were labeled as soft on communism, when they were only hard on Nazism. Even elements of the Catholic Church had done their best to provide escape routes for war criminals, so why should the U.S. government waste its resources and sacrifice its foreign policy objectives on hunting down and dismantling the very networks that would help them win the Cold War? In Germany itself, former high-ranking Nazi intelligence officers, such as Wehrmacht General Reinhard Gehlen, found themselves working for Allied intelligence against the Soviets. Gehlen would jumpstart the CIA's anti-Soviet operations from West Germany, using his network of operatives throughout the East. It is debatable today how much the Gehlen organization really contributed to anti-Soviet intelligence operations, with some observers believing that it was simply a boondoggle for unemployed former Nazi spies who merely pretended to conduct espionage activities without providing any intel of value. But that's the point, isn't it? The post-war Nazi apparatus worked for itself, not for the Western Allies, nor for the Soviets. They had their own agenda from the start. Charismatic Nazi figures such as Otto Skorzeny were figureheads for thousands of German soldiers and SS men who still revered the memory of Hitler and of the Reich. At first, they formed an underground escape movement that began in Austria and extended elsewhere in Europe, and which had channels throughout the continent and to northern Africa, Asia, and the Western Hemisphere. But Skorzeny was not only a cheerleader for these individuals, he also had business interests and access to funds that had been hidden in Swiss banks and in financial institutions in different parts of the globe. He helped train commandos for the Palestine Liberation Organization, including a young Yasser Arafat. Egypt, particularly under President Nasser, was a hotbed of scientists and military specialists who had worked for the Reich, some of whom were involved in developing rocket systems for attacks on Israel. At the same time, it has been revealed that he was a source, if not an asset, for CIA operations in Europe and the Middle East. He was considered apolitical, not really a committed Nazi, by CIA officers in Europe and elsewhere, who found his connections among the wealthy and well-connected of Europe, as well as among his former comrades in the SS, to be valuable resources in their struggle against the Soviet Union. Yet further investigation has shown that he was a welcome guest at gatherings of former SS officers in Europe as well as in Latin America, along with famed Luftwaffe ace pilot Hans-Ulrich Rudel, who, like Scorsese, was also a consultant to the U.S. government, specifically, in Rudel's case, on aviation design matters. Both Scorsese and Rudel had appeared at Colonia Dignidad in Chile, which was used as a base for Operation Condor, the aggressive anti-communist alliance of Chile, Argentina, and other Latin American governments that performed assassinations and acts of sabotage and terrorism in the United States, Latin America, and Europe. Scorsese was also influential in the formation of SEDADE, which was a Spanish-based neo-Nazi publishing and propaganda operation, and, with his former comrade Gerhard Mertens, had formed Merex AG, an arms trading firm that specialized in the export of German-made weapons and, in at least one case, an F-86 Sabre jet sale to Pakistan. It was Mertens who founded the Circle Colonia Dignidad, which raised funds from German Nazi sympathizers to help support the notorious Chilean colony. Thus, the view of Scorsese held by American intelligence officers that he was purely a military man who could be depended upon for intel and expertise in the fight against the Soviet Union was undercut by Scorsese's other activities, from training Palestinian commandos to keeping the flame of Nazism alive in such torture centers as Colonia Dignidad, and from selling arms to nations hostile to Israel to advising the Egyptian government on the employment of former Nazi scientists in the development of missiles to attack the Jewish nation. How is this relevant to an investigation of the stories concerning Nazi UFOs? Scorsese represents the more or less public face of a deep underground network of collaborators who seems to be working on behalf of the United States, or at least of anti-Soviet interests, but who in actuality had different objectives and loyalties. These collaborators included not only military veterans, but committed SS officers who never denounced Nazism, not even long after the war had ended. They included a kind of Nazi intelligentsia of scientists, particularly experts in weapons research and design, who put their expertise and their imagination at the service of a Fourth Reich, while at the same time pretending to work for a more innocent, anti-communist league. They were supported in this endeavor not only by Scorsese and Rudel, as well as the heads of sympathetic governments such as Nasser in Egypt, Perón in Argentina, and Stroessner in Paraguay, but also by a global network of German technical and industrial firms that had been established not only in Europe, but in the Americas, Australia, Africa, and Asia, as well as import-export firms such